Okay, welcome to our fourth video for data analysis in Google Sheets. In this video, we're going to consider a new research question, and I'm going to give you guys opportunities to pause the video and have you actually do some of your own work inside of Google Sheets. So I want you to try to move ahead of me and then check your work as we go. The research question we want to look into today is how is apparel app use related to people's willingness to download an app for exclusive sales and purposes? All right. Once again, we're looking at some sort of relationship, right? So we're relating two things, two variables. And remember, our variables always end up being the columns inside of our data set. So we want to look at the first variable will be apparel app use, and the second variable is going to be the willingness of participants to download an app for an exclusive sale purpose. All right, so our next step is to jump over to the data and find these columns. Okay, here's our data, and below we can see the pivot table and the chart that we generated for our last research question. Now, when we're dealing with a new research question, we want to make sure to generate a brand new pivot table. The reason for this is if we make any changes to this pivot table here, it's going to be reflected in our new chart. So if we decided to reuse this pivot table to explore two new different variables, we're going to lose all of the work from our previous research question. So in our first step, we want to highlight all of our data and add a new pivot table. So pause the video at this point, try this on your own, see if you can get it to work. Okay. Remember, we can use our Command A to quickly highlight everything, or Control A if you're on a PC. And then we want to go to the Data tab and go down to Pivot Table. We'll see a new pivot table appear below. We might want to rename this Research Question 2 Pivot Table. And now we're ready to start selecting our columns and our rows. Remember the variables that we want to work with in this case. We split this up as apparel app use, so basically whether or not somebody uses apparel apps, and their willingness to download an app for exclusive sales and purposes. What we want to do next is click into the pivot table so that the pivot table editor shows up. And now we want to choose, for each one of these variables just highlighted, we want to choose one to go in the rows and one to go in the columns. When we use the Add button, all of the different variables in our data set, which correspond to our columns, are listed. So we can scroll through and find the ones that are appropriate for these two, for this specific research question. So pause the video at this point. Read through your options and see if you can select the two variables that would be appropriate. Okay, so one of the variables you should select is number 10. Do you currently use Apparel Brands mobile app for online shopping? Right? This is getting at our apparel app use. The second one, which I'm going to add to the columns, is number 14. I would download and use an Apparel Brands mobile app if we were offered an exclusive sale. Okay. Remember, just adding the variables doesn't mean you get content to your table. To do that, you need to add a value. You can pick the answers to either one of those, so I'm just going to pick the answers to 10 since it appeared first. The summary function that you want is count A, and then if you want to, you can represent this as percentage of your rows or percentage of your columns. Like in the last video, I'm going to look at it as percentage of rows. Excellent. So this is our pivot table. The next thing we want to do is input a chart that nicely summarizes it. Pause the video and try this on your own. Okay, so the chart that you generated probably looks a little funny. I'm sure you followed the directions that we did in the last video. So you highlighted both the column titles and the row titles as well as the content. And then you did Insert Chart. And you probably ended up with something that looks like this. And unfortunately, this has some weird data associated to it. What's going on over here? We know that our answers should either be yes or no, but it looks like we have a third category. Here's what happened. Google Sheets takes its best guess as to what you're trying to plot. And since in the top here we have numbers, numerical possible responses, it thought that this was additional data that you wanted to include in the plot. So here's how we're going to correct this. Let's get rid of this particular chart. This time, let's just highlight the content of the table and then the possible answers in the rows, so no and yes. We'll insert a chart, This is looking better, although the problem now is that our x-axis is not labeled. So the next thing we want to do is, if you're inside of your chart and your chart editor is open, you'll notice that there's a little bubble that says Add X-Axis. This is really just going to add x-axis labels. When we click this, a small dialog box is going to pop up. And now we don't have to click in, but all we have to do is highlight the piece that we want to use for the titles, right? So we want 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These are going to be the titles below each one of our grouped bar plots. Do include the question number 10 as well. And now we'll get the appropriate axis labels. In the same way that you would proofread an email or edit and revise a paper before turning it in, anytime you create a data visualization, you should take a critical look at it. Think about it and ask yourself, does this actually represent the information that I think it's representing? This particular plot we just created is a classic example of this. If we don't look too deeply, it seems like everything is working fine. We have our answers, right? 1 through 5. This is indicating the participant's willingness to download an app for an exclusive sale. And we have bars above it, which are representing some sort of percentages. But if we look quickly at the bars, something strange happens here, right? Hovering over the bar, you see that we have a 70% saying yes, and we have a 39% saying no, which should strike you as a little bit weird because 70% plus 40%, right, roughly speaking, is not 100%. So it doesn't seem like these bars are really representative of what's going on as percentages of people who answered question number 5. And in fact, that's not the case. This is, however, the way that we expect this type of visual to work. Think about research question 1, right? Here we have our female, and if you add up all of the percentages for each one of the bars appearing there, these would add up to 100%. So we can compare the bars above female as percentages of that type, right? And if we think of why this works, we can jump back to our original pivot table for research question 1, and we see that each one of the rows is appearing along the x-axis of the plot. And when we looked at our counts, we did percentage of row as the default value on the inside. Now if we jump back to our plot and pivot table for research question 2, we can see what went wrong. For our rows, these aren't appearing along the x-axis. These instead are appearing as our colors. And so when we do percent of row, we're using the wrong percentages in this case. We can fix this very easily. We can change percent of row to percent of column. And not only will our pivot table update, but we'll also start to see our chart correctly reflect what's going on. So of the people that answered 1, 100% of them were no's. Same with number 2. In 3, we start to see a slightly different mix. In 4, we see a different mix, etc. And from this, we can see the trend that people who are more willing to download the app are also already using apps. We have other methods of fixing this. Let's put this back to percent of row, as we had in the previous case. And again, notice that the thing that's going wrong here is that the possible row entries are not appearing along the x-axis. If you double-click your chart so that the chart editor appears, and you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you can see that there's an option, Switch Rows and Columns, that's been automatically selected for us. This happened when Google Sheets attempted to guess what type of plot we wanted to use. In this case, if we uncheck this, if we unswitch our rows and columns, we end up with a picture that's a lot more similar to research question 1. We now have yes and no along the x-axis. We have the type of response color-coded, and you can see that if you hover over, your percentages now are going to add up to 100%. So this is a more classic version of the chart, following the same research question 1 chart that we had before. The last thing I want to show you in this particular video is a different option for visualizing this information. So we currently have what we call a grouped bar plot, and this has each one of your possible answers to question 14 as a separate bar. Now, fundamentally, we're looking at percentages here. So what we could do is take these 3 different groups, or in this case, 5 different groups, and represent them as a single bar where the amount of coloring is representative of the percentage of that particular answer. This is called a 100% stacked bar plot, and it's very easy to take what you currently have and change it into that format. We can go to column chart inside of our chart editor, and we have 3 different options, right? We have our standard column chart, we have a stacked column chart, and then we have the 100% stacked column chart. The 100% one's better when you're dealing with percentages, so we're going to select this one. And you can see how this visualization works. For those that said yes, we only got 3 different types of responses, 3, 4, and 5. And you can see that the amount of coloring for this quote-unquote yes bar is proportional to the percentages of those answers. Over on the other side, for no, we got all 5 possible answers, 1 through 5. And again, the lengths of each color correspond to the percentage of those types of answers of the people who said no. And so from this plot here, we can kind of see that there is a much more, for people who don't currently have an app that they're using, there's much more of a mixed response as to whether they would download one, whereas those who do have an app are more willing to get those exclusive sales. There's another way to visualize this information, and this is based on the plot that we started with earlier. Remember, to get the current plot, we ended up unchecking this box, switch columns and rows. If we recheck it, we go back to the case where we have 1 through 5 along the x-axis, and now we're coloring by yes and no's. And once again, we'll notice that the percentages don't seem to add up to 100% above each one of our options. And we can recall that that happens because our pivot table is, the values in our pivot table are represented as percent of row, whereas what we really want is percent of columns, because our column possibilities are across that x-axis. So in switching that, we get a new visualization. It's still a 100% stacked bar plot. And we can double check these seem to add to 100%, so we're good to go. And once again, we see the trend that as you increase in your willingness, you also see an increase in the people who said yes, they currently have a mobile app downloaded and that they're using. Okay, so once you've decided on which visualization you want to use, whether it's this one or the other, remember, it's good practice to move this to a different chart, or move the chart to a different sheet so that it's easier to view. I'm going to leave this particular one. I think it's easier to interpret. It sort of gets at our relationship. So I'm going to click in the upper right-hand corner, move to its own sheet, and then remember to change this research question 2 chart to something that's easy to find. You can also do other things in Google Sheets, like change your titles, and clean up other aspects of the chart, but I think that's enough for this video. Okay, thank you.